A big thank you to all of my listeners. And if you would like to support this transmission even more and boost your trading account, go to trendfollowing.com/now. And without any further delay, on to today's show. This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Coveil. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. A super positive guest today, Jenny Blake, in support of her new book, Pivot, The Only Move That Matters Is Your Next One. Formerly at Google, Jenny has a wide perspective that I think just about anyone can learn from, especially when you have that moment in your life where you feel like you're at a plateau and you know deep down you need to pivot, you need to make a change, but you're not sure how to get past the fear. Jenny Blake brings great insights. I hope you enjoy this conversation. So Jenny, as a guy in my 40s, about 6 foot tall, 185 pounds, maybe close to 190, former baseball catcher in a past life, do I get any brownie points with you that after 4 years of yoga, I've been able to do it for a while, but I can do the full splits? Do I get any brownie points for the full splits?
Oh my gosh. What?
Yes. I'll send you a picture.
I can barely do a full split, and I've been doing yoga for 10 years. That's incredible. Have you always been naturally flexible, or did you somehow ninja yourself into being able to doing the splits?
I ninja'd myself because in an all-star baseball game when I was 15, I tore my hamstring, and then I became a constant stretcher.
Wow, that is so amazing. I am very impressed. You get mega brownie points.
Except, now I've mentioned this a couple times in my show because the yoga conversations have come up. So I'm sure my audience is going to be like, okay, there Mike goes again. He's going to try and tell everybody how great he is in yoga. But I think it's a great place to start with you because there's a lot that I want to dig into with you in your new book, Pivot. But yoga is clearly very important to you. And I would love for you to talk to the audience. Some people have never practiced yoga. Some people, probably guys especially, probably still think it's maybe frou-frou or something. Talk about yoga and you and why it's so important to you. And frankly, I'm guessing in some way, definitely a way because I've read your book, the role that it plays in your work and your life.
Sure. And by the way, I used to be a catcher too.
Really?
Not for very long, but when I played softball, it's a great position, I have to say.
You can see everything.
Yeah. And like lots of action. You can see everything. It's really fun. And then I kind of loved stopping all the balls, like just trying to be not let anything by. That was really fun, very challenging. What I love about yoga is I believe that your body is your business in the sense that, particularly when I left Google, by the time I left, there were 60,000 people working there. And if I was having an off day or in a bad mood or sleep deprived, it's really no big deal as far as the net impact on the company. It would kind of get amortized into the business. And then when I left 5.5 years ago, I very quickly realized that as my only employee for my business, if I was sleep deprived or hungover, in a bad mood or having a sugar crash, that now my business was operating at 50%. And that was unacceptable to me. Even when I was at Google, yoga was my source of sanity during the week. I used to teach a geeky yoga class in New York for entrepreneurs and people who sit at the computer all day. And it was many guy friends that would take the class. So I always tell people, I have a lot of people say to me, oh my gosh, I'm not flexible. I could not do yoga, or I get really bored. And I kind of say, yeah, that's fine. That's the point. I've been going 10 years. I love it. And I still have days where I'm bored or creaky or impatient or any of the things that can happen. And yet it is such a source of strength and flexibility. It's such a good practice for the body. I really think it's one of the physical practices that can keep us agile for a very long time. And as you know from my book Pivot, I study agility in terms of mindset and careers and business, but then to not also complement that with physical practices that include things like yoga, I think is a big miss, especially because getting our body into a different physical state. I mean, this is the purpose of asana yoga, doing poses, was really to set people up for effective meditation at the end. Teachers will often say, the whole practice has been leading up to Shavasana, which is corpse pose, where you're laying there. And that actually you work and suffer and do what you do for that entire hour so that your mind is primed by that end to release. Meditation has been one of the biggest accelerators that I've had for focus and clarity and calm and purpose in my career and business. And I'm always hesitant to say that because a lot of meditation teachers will say there's no goal and every session is different. But I have to say, looking back at now 3 years of a daily practice, it's been a game changer. So I would couple meditation and yoga together.
And we could talk hours about yoga, so we can't do that. You've got something you want to talk about today, so do I. Let's jump right in though to the idea that I think for me, one of the big picture ideas, life, our careers, what we want to do, our passions, is utter chaos. It's utter chaos. How did we get to this point where we think that everything should be a straight line? And so many of us want to stay on that straight line. And if the line feels like it's breaking, even though the breaking of the line is impossible because there is no line, that people just completely stress out. But you really go into the idea of like, hey, hold on, let's get away from this linear career thinking.
It's the paradox of change, which is that we all are hungry for adventure and a sense of curiosity and being engaged with life, and our comfort zone is only comfortable for so long, and then we get bored. And yet, on the other hand, we really resist change. We wish that things could stay the same. We kind of reject, especially when change feels like it chooses us, whether that's a job ending or a relationship ending. So there is a paradox here about how we look at life and change. The interesting thing that I have found while studying this the last few years when it comes to career and the new economic landscape is that pretty much since 2008, I would say, things started to go a little haywire where people realized, oh my goodness, anything can happen at any time. My company could let me go or restructure or reorganize or get acquired, and then I could get fired. And by the way, I've seen that all occur when I was doing interviews for this book. And we just increasingly have globalization, outsourcing, and automation. And it's really exciting. I love seeing what's happening with AI and bots and robotics and all of that. But the effect that it has, and also combined with social media and being able to see what everyone else is doing, has created a certain restlessness. It's really broken the myth of security, of a 30-year job with a pension plan at the end. And most people now, when I say that, it's kind of obvious. Like, yeah, I know I'm not going to work somewhere for 30 years. Up till recently, I think we were able to pretend. Now everyone is experiencing it. And at first I thought it was just me. I thought there was something wrong with me, that I was asking what's next every few years in my career and not happy at places like Google. And then when I was self-employed, my bank account got all the way down to zero because I couldn't answer that question. And then as I started interviewing people for the book, I realized we're all feeling an acceleration here. We are all having to ask and answer what's next much more frequently than in the past.
Just for some background, so you know who you're talking to, having written a bunch of trading books, and I kind of was living in San Diego 4 years ago, and I got hired to do a speaking tour in Asia, and I decided not to leave. So I'm talking to you today from Saigon, Vietnam, and that's been my meditation, which is to just essentially get away from, even though I've not done the research that you've done in terms of like what's actually going on in our minds and the career and all these choices and the decision making, ditching the cognitive junk food. I feel like that's what I've been trying to do. And I think that's what I really like about the detail that you go into, is you really are trying to get people off what you really nicely refer to as this cognitive junk food. We are eating cognitive junk food all day long, and it's not helping us.
Yes, and I have to give credit to Cal Newport for that term. He wrote a book called Deep Work. He really studies that. He studies this surface level thinking, and that he says our skills for deep work are decaying, actually, that because of that cognitive junk food, social media, email, surfing the internet, if we're not disciplined about carving out deep work windows for ourselves, that skill will atrophy, which I find really fascinating. And I love what you just said. I mean, it's so interesting how life can kind of take us on this path. Pivots don't all have to be career oriented. Some of them are location pivots. So for you to really connect with Vietnam and resonate and stay there is fascinating.
Yeah, I think I'm getting close to being able to write a book just on this, but
yeah, definitely.
One of the things, though, to get back to this, I'm sorry if I keep taking you off on tangents, but you've got a really interesting background and stuff.
They're the best.
But, what I love too is there's an expression that you've said, and I'm kind of paraphrasing a little bit here. If change is the only constant, let's get better at it. And I see this in my world too, is that change is the only thing. So what you have to do is you have to put yourself in a position to respond to change. Perhaps you can proactively get ahead of it, but most likely not. You have to respond to it. It's the only thing that we know for sure is going to happen. Change.
It's really strange because part of the reason I became obsessed with this topic is I was not feeling very resilient to change. I was just getting completely rocked by not knowing what was next in my business. I was going through a breakup at the same time, and I felt so beaten down. It's weird because I've read Buddhist and Taoist books for a very long time. I really resonate with that. And they've been talking for 4,000 years about change and going with the flow and not attaching to things. It struck me as funny that, how can I be so maladapted? Because it's true. Other than death and taxes, the only other guarantee we really have is that things are going to change. But once I understood how much that had crept into the career realm, whereas it hadn't necessarily in the past, then I thought there's this line I love from Agile Development that each time you repeat a task, take one step toward automating it. And I love systems and efficiency. It really bothered me that my search for what's next had been so inefficient to the point where, again, I got down to zero financially, wasn't going to be able to pay the rent in 2 weeks, was going to have to quit my business and move out of New York, neither of which I wanted to do. So that really bothered me. And then I thought, well, if we're all having to answer what's next more often, we've got to get better at it. We hear the word pivot thrown around in business circles all the time, but I really wanted to unpack, well, what does that mean and how do we get better at it? And I've come to really believe that pivot is one. The reason I chose that term to apply it to career and not just business is it's judgment neutral and gender neutral. It's not a crisis. It doesn't have to be. There's nothing wrong with you. A pivot is a normal thing. And it's a skill set. It's one that we can get better at. And so that was my real purpose behind creating what I call the pivot method, this 4-stage process to help us all get better at it and more efficient so we can spend our time and brain power on what really matters most to us.
I'm going to pull you through those 4 steps in a moment, but I think from a big picture standpoint, talk about the word plateau. And I think it's also interesting to note that the way you talk about pivot, you say, hey, this is not plan B, it's plan A.
Well, when startups talk about pivoting, it is plan B. They say that, we're failing at plan A. We've got to pivot to save the business from collapse. YouTube used to be a video dating site. Twitter used to be a podcasting service. And when those directions didn't pan out, the companies pivoted to stay in business. And at first I thought that's what was happening in career. But then I realized that these plateaus are normal. And when I say plateau, it's a general sense that work's fine. It's okay. You're kind of bored. There's maybe a slight dissatisfaction. There's really a whisper in your gut saying, there's more out there for you. If you don't pay attention to the plateau, it starts to feel like an active decline. Getting physically sick, headaches at work, all kinds of things where your body starts really trying to yell and shout and get your attention to say, this isn't working. And if you don't pay attention to the signs of decline, that's often where people get pivoted. They get laid off. Something happens where they look back and they say, oh yeah, that needed to happen for months. Not always, but a lot of the time. In career, instead of seeing these plateaus as, because that was a big mistake I made too, was taking it so personally that, there's something wrong with me and why am I here? But actually it's a sign of our success that whether you work for someone else or you're self-employed, when you hit a plateau, it's kind of like you've mastered that previous level of this video game of life and business that we're playing. When that's the case, it's very natural to then turn your attention toward what's next. I wrote this book for people I call high net growth. So while they may aim for money, kind of, we know the term high net worth individuals, people who are high net growth, it's not just about the money. They really want to be learning and growing and ultimately making an impact. So when they hit a plateau, it's not about the money anymore. It's really about what's next and how can I continue growing and making the biggest impact on the world that I'm able to.
Let me dig in on an issue that I find that I relate to in my world, which is the idea of peak performers. You, Jenny, did not just sit down at the word processing app and start typing. You went out into the field, you talked to peak performers looking to, and again, this is what I really relate to. I did this with traders, looking to reverse engineer what it is that they had learned, the ones that had the most successful career pivots. I would love for you to really dig into some of that research and how you went about your process to, you can talk from approaching some of the peak performers to perhaps some unexpected lessons that they gave you or insights they gave you about some of their most successful career pivots.
I really sought to interview a wide variety of people because I also didn't want people to just look at peak performers because I tried to think of what celebrities can I talk about or athletes or people who really made it. And what's interesting is when you take finances out of the equation, someone's pivot options increase. Like if they're set for life, or I talk about Jerry Seinfeld in the book, he's like a gazillionaire. So while I do unpack his pivot, he had many more options than somebody who is constrained by finances in some ways. And the reason I'm saying this is just to highlight that career changes tend to bring out some of our biggest fears around being able to provide for ourselves. There are peak performers, and then there's also all of us who are peak in some way. And the biggest key that everybody had in common when the pivots were the most successful, it was because somebody doubled down on what was already working. It was already under their feet. And I know that's kind of like a weird thing to say because it can be frustrating when you're the person at a pivot point and unsure about what to do. And if I were to say, the answer is already within you, it's already under your feet, it can be kind of obnoxious. But at the same time, there are clues there. The people, when the pivots didn't work out, it was usually because people tried to turn too sharply from where they are right now to their next move. And that's when they had to kind of double back and pivot again and change. When a person can really examine what's already working best, what their strengths are, what they're already enjoying most, who they already know, what their experience already is, and what fields they're already part of, and identify what success looks like for them personally 1 year out, then they're really anchored. Now, when they search for options about what to do next, it's very targeted. And then another thing that peak performers, and let's call them peak pivoters, have in common is that they're constantly experimenting. If you're not running small experiments, it's a lot easier to get caught with your proverbial pants down when something happens that's outside of your control, because that's when the pivot points feel very jarring. But for people who are sort of constantly making a practice out of running small experiments in their business or their career or a side hustle, they've always got a couple irons in the fire that are giving them information about whether they like this thing they're experimenting with, whether they can get good at it, and whether there's room to expand. So as we become better at pivoting, it's also becoming better at experimenting so that no one thing, we hear this a lot in the world of entrepreneurship about multiple streams of income, but we can also have multiple streams of career so that no one thing going haywire is going to completely paralyze us.
One more thing I want to bring up before I go into plant, scan, pilot, launch, and lead. But I want to read something from you that I really like, and I think we should talk about this before we jump into the pivot method. I hate to be the bearer of semi-bad news, but the things that scare you shitless require action before they reward you with the courage cookie to keep going. Big undertakings require a belief, even a tiny microscopic speck of belief that you can and deserve to give something your best shot, regardless of whether you succeed or fail. Getting around that paragraph to even get started to get to the pivot point is tough, isn't it?
Yes. A lot of people wait. They want to wait until they feel courageous to make a change. That I'll somehow feel ready. And to an extent, that's true. It's where I think mindfulness practices are so helpful. There will come a time in your gut where you just know. So many pivoters I interviewed, no matter whether they also had financial criteria or date-based timing criteria, ultimately, the final call, the final referee was their gut that said, yep, it's time, even whether it seemed logical or not. That said, a lot of people want to wait until they feel courageous, and it just doesn't work that way. You take action steps first, and those steps, the reason I call them courage cookies is then you get rewarded. You get a little cookie that gives you more courage. Sometimes those cookies are in the form of really cool people you stumble across or you meet, and really fortuitous events happening. And so sometimes those courage cookies are real rewards, kind of letting you know, oh yeah, you're on the right track, keep going. But the courage does not come up front. It's a byproduct of taking action.
Let's get into some specifics, because as I hold this book in front of me, this, as you just mentioned, it's dense. So here we are, we're having a very kind of gut level conversation, but this is for those people that if I was thinking almost on these days, I hear some people say good things about it, some people say bad, but if I was thinking in the Myers-Briggs type of thinking on the judging versus perceiving, for those judging people that want to have action executable here, boop, 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 boop. I mean, this is very detailed.
Yeah, I'm like, if you look up a J in a Myers-Briggs dictionary, that's me. I'm right there. I have a color-coded bookshelf and handwritten to-do lists everywhere.
I'm a hardcore P, so we're not compatible.
Very nice. Very nice. I have a friend who says, I will never date a P again. She's a J. She has ruled out all Ps for dating potential.
Well, let's jump into the first one. Let's get into plant. So this is the first part of your pivot method. Plant. Why don't you give a description of it and perhaps an example that people can latch on to?
Sure. And a note on the nomenclature. This all came to me through the metaphor of a basketball player. When they stop dribbling, a basketball player plants their feet, and one foot stays planted while the other foot the pivot foot scans for passing options. And this really helped me when I was trying to rebuild my business back and stay afloat. Plant is about getting grounded. And that's what I mentioned earlier, the strengths, interests, experience, what's already working. That's so critical. And plant is also about where you want to end up 1 year from now. So for example, when I was just in my 5th and final year at Google, I was doing coaching and career development. When I left, I pivoted to doing coaching and career development still, just self-employed. So I planted in my strengths, which were coaching and career. So if I had quit Google to become a full-time yoga teacher, that would have been a much sharper turn and probably would have sent me into my panic zone about how to provide for myself. But because the moves were actually quite related, even though leaving Google felt like a big risk for me at the time, there was a lot in common still. And I knew part of the reason I made the choice to leave was this other part of the plant stage, which is vision. And my vision really was, I want to be as helpful to as many people as possible. And I can either support 60,000 Googlers internally, or I can leave and try and make an even bigger impact when my first book was launching in 2011. So the vision is also what pulls us forward. And between where you are now and where you want to end up, these are some of our known variables. Even if you don't know exactly how to get where you want to end up or exactly even what it looks like, you start to frame and bracket the pivot conversation between these two things, where you are now, where you want to end up. Then you can scan. And so from that really rooted, grounded place of stability, 50% of you is grounded, then you can scan. And scanning involves looking for people, skills, and projects that are compelling and that are based on what you already identified in the plant stage.
What happens if you just skip the plant stage and you go straight to scanning? I think that's what I did.
Everybody does that. Honestly, that's why I wrote this book, because I used to do I trained over 1,000 people when I was at Google, including managers and directors. And when you have really smart go-getters, the problem solving goes like this. I'm at a pivot point. What's out there? What's next? What's out there? And the first impulse is to start scanning first. And a lot of people just don't take the time to plant because maybe it seems kind of woo-woo, or I've done that before, or vision can be scary because, well, what if you don't know? Or what if you say something really exciting and then the fear rushes in about whether or not that's possible? So almost everybody does skip the plant stage, myself included. And that's what kept me spinning in circles for far longer than necessary. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because most people do. Their instinct is to skip right over it.
Let me bring up something in scanning this. So this is about looking around, finding new sources of information, either physical information or from another individual, looking into other opportunities. I think one of the things that maybe I'm just silly because I've not seen it expressed like this, but I like your expression of one-off mentoring. I look back nearly 20 years ago and I was doing that without knowing what I was doing, going to just knock on doors of literally influential, successful people, very almost Anthony Robbins-esque, go knock on the door of the people that you want to be like. But the one-off mentoring, talk about that. I think that's a really critical thing that a lot of people are very scared to do. They're very scared to call up a high achiever, a peak performance type person, someone that maybe has got a little bit of street cred or press or whatever. They're intimidated. They don't want to reach out. But it's amazing when you reach out to those types of people, how many of them will actually give you the time. Now, you can't just necessarily drop an email and expect instant reaction. You might have to get off your duff and do a little work. But it's amazing how many of those types of people, and as you use the word in your book as well, scrappy. If you get a little scrappy in you, it's amazing what happens, for the one-off mentoring.
Yeah, I'm all about one-off mentoring because a lot of people feel pressure that they need to find a mentor. And it's such a weird thing to try and pluck a person out of the ether and say to them, will you be my mentor? It just is really awkward. So one-off mentoring takes the pressure off of that and gives people encouragement to kind of just connect on a one-off basis. And then if you both resonate with that conversation and it goes really well, then you can schedule follow-up and you can just kind of build very naturally, just as any friendship would begin. One of the things that I think sometimes people then take this advice almost too far of like reaching out willy-nilly. And even James Altucher, I love how he talks about when you try and find a mentor, don't ask them, how can I help you? Because you're just creating more work for them. So part of what I've always tried to do is be interesting in my own right. So everyone's different because you may have had great success reaching out to really big fish, as I call them. But for me, I like peer mentors as well. I call them friendtors in the book. I like connecting with people who are at my level or just above in some areas, and maybe I can help them in others. I like setting up mutually beneficial calls. I hate the phrase, can I pick your brain? Some of the mistakes people make when they go for one-off mentors is, how can I help you? Or can I pick your brain? It's better, I think, to also focus on being interesting, like do cool stuff so that your potential mentors are really interested to talk to you as well when you reach out to them. And it's not to wait forever. And no, you don't have to be perfect. And yes, many people will want to pay it forward, but just consider and kind of put yourself in their shoes. And then, of course, I think it's such a gift when people who are farther ahead say, yes, I've had people help me along and I would love to pay it forward and have that mindset. And a great mentor, so many great mentors are givers. They don't want anything from you. And I love the notion that, not every exchange has to be an even one, but it all kind of comes around in a more global community cosmic sense.
I think also, too, for me, I was motivated to find out what was at the top. And I think ultimately, if anybody has the chance in their life to get around some of those world-famous, world-class peak performers, it gets back to Anders Ericsson in practice. I mean, they're still people. They put their pants on the same way. And for me, that was, once I had that realization that the top was the same as the bottom, except for more hard work, then you kind of relax and you say, oh, okay, I get this now.
I love that. That's really cool. Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah. Have in your conversations with super peak performers, you mentioned hard work. Have you noticed anything that seems to make them very agile to change or effective at pivoting in their careers?
Brutal honesty. I think for the people in my world that I've had a chance to come in contact, many connected to trading and investment, just a real brutal honesty. So many, if you go work for an investment bank, that's one different type of career path. But for some of these independent traders that were just kind of like managing their friends and family money and growing it into a big fund, it's a very independent solo venture. There's just no room for any self-delusion. A lot of that, I think, probably naturally rubbed off on me. But then you also start to realize, and you know this at Google, is that some of the people that showed up at Google, the first 20, 50, 100, 200 employees, doesn't necessarily mean that they were that much more intelligent or hard workers than the next 1,000. But those first bunch made a lot more money. And that's an interesting thing for people to deal with today, too, because sometimes, and you mentioned the high net growth versus high net worth, that's a really great comparison. And I think we should all strive to be in the growth category, because competing on net worth, I mean, we're in a lottery society. You don't know who's going to be the next billionaire. It could happen tomorrow to who knows who.
Right. Yeah, that's so true. There really is such a big element of luck and luck's such an interesting term. I mean, we could unpack that for a long time too, but that for some people, part of their path is striking it on those lottery tickets. And then for others, it's not. And yet I think it all works out as it's supposed to somehow in the end.
Hey, before I jump into a couple more of the steps in your pivot method, I want to talk about some other side issues that I think are really important that you address in your work. The happiness formula. I don't think many of us, and myself included, necessarily sit around, and this is the J in you, really think about what is happiness and try to write it out. And I think we can all get messed up sometimes if we try and keep this fuzzy vision of what happiness is. We don't necessarily can't write everything down and figure everything out, but the happiness formula, why don't you speak to that in your thinking?
Yeah, the happiness formula is just, what are your ingredients that I call them kind of daily, whether it's morning rituals, evening rituals, micro elements, like how you're eating, to macro elements, like where you live. What is it that's part of your formula? And this came to me when I was doing coaching with a client who wanted to move across the country and was contemplating business school. We really unpacked, he was having heart problems, staying in the same place. And, while we can't 100% say that they were connected, that most likely it was his heart problems were resurfacing because he was not happy in his life and his job. He wanted to be near the beach. He wanted to step out of the family business for a little bit. He was kind of burdened by shoulds, what he should be doing. And so when we unpacked his happiness formula, we just realized all these ingredients that weren't currently present. And so I love making lists of, if I could write a menu for myself that I could then order from on any given day when I need a pick-me-up, what does that menu include? And we talked about yoga, meditation, reading a great book, going for a walk, dinner with friends, living in New York, building business systems or something I love. And so everybody listening to this can take a minute, and I encourage you to just write down 10 ingredients of your happiness formula. I even struggle with the word happiness because part of what happened to me during my pivot is I was trying so much to return to a state of happiness that it was counterproductive. And at a certain point, I gave up on that. And I just said, equanimity is what I'm looking for. If I find happiness, fine, but I can't keep aiming for it because it's too frustrating. And the research shows that to be true as well, that actually trying to be happy is counterproductive toward that aim. It can more so be a byproduct of other things that we're doing that bring us fulfillment.
Along those lines, too, so many times I'll hear people say, well, I can't start until I figure out what my passion is.
Oh, yeah, right. That's what I call in the book project-based purpose. Just like one-off mentors takes the pressure off of a holy grail mentor, not everyone has a core driving life purpose, and that's fine. So project-based purpose, whatever you're working on for the next 2 years, why? What do you hope to get out of it? What do you hope to learn? You could even say that for a relationship if you wanted. That takes the pressure off of one all-encompassing life purpose. Though if you do want one, I encourage people, you can borrow mine, which I think is pretty universally applicable, which is just, how can I be as helpful as possible to as many people as possible? And my way of helpfulness is probably going to change over the years. My first book was Life After College. I certainly didn't want to talk about life after college for the rest of my career. But in hindsight, that was another book about navigating a big transition. So Pivot is not dissimilar from it. They come from this core place of wanting to be helpful. And I think whether someone is helpful to their nuclear family and raising a family and providing for that, or creating works that go out to more people, it's all good. So just think about what's your unique way that you enjoy being helpful to people.
The first step is plant, then scan. And your third piece of the puzzle is the pilot, the experiment. How are you going to, if somebody is in a particular situation, it's a plateau, they've done their planting, they've done the scanning, but they've now got to take some initial move. Now, I've not done the research here. You've done a tremendous amount of research, and you can already tell I will do things a little bit spur in the moment. I would probably just jump, not even experiment.
You're a perfect pea.
But I don't think most people really don't do that. So I have to realize that I am a tad unusual, and it's not necessarily a good thing either. I think you do make a good point with the experimentation. Why don't you explain that from your perspective?
Piloting is where things start to get really fun. Pilots are meant, you can see a similar theme on my end too, which is that let's take the pressure off of the one answer. And my editor and I were very careful not to use the word leap or jump in the book. The fourth stage launch used to be called leap. And we changed it because we realized that by reducing risk through the first three stages of the pivot method, it's no longer a leap. It's just launching into the next direction. Piloting is about, just like a TV pilot is one episode to test with audiences to see if they should buy the whole series. Career pilots are 10 to 20% projects or experiments that can help you test the 3 E's that I mentioned earlier: enjoyment, expertise, and expansion. We don't often think about pilots in the career sense, but you can, whether that's starting an initiative within your company, just like Google has 10 and 20% projects, taking a class, experimenting with a new product offering for your audience or a new pricing model. I even consider small pilots could be asking someone out to lunch to learn more. So that, that's a really low key, low pressure. A longer term pilot might be, again, kind of starting, for me, podcasting started as a pilot. I started really scrappy. As you mentioned, I say in the book, get scrappy was a motto we had at Google, as was launch and iterate. So when I first started my podcast, I would record using my crappy iPhone mic. I would do a conference call with someone. I would upload that to SoundCloud. And I even said on SoundCloud, I don't have any fancy intro music or outro music, but here's my podcast. And I did that for a year. And then finally, a year later, I was having so much fun. And so I took it into iTunes. It's called the Pivot Podcast. I love it. I had no idea how much I was going to enjoy doing exactly what we're doing right now, and also getting to interview guests. And those are my heroes, people who've written my favorite books. It was this great way to learn a new skill. I taught myself GarageBand. There's so much good that can come from a pilot. And when a pilot's really working, it grows and expands. And now, my focus has been on writing the book, but as soon as the book is out, I'm ready to double down on the podcast, which is a huge surprise. I really was not expecting that. And I'll just highlight one more principle from Pivot, which is that I've been doing career coaching for 8 years. So interestingly enough, podcasting is not a 180 from that either, because my job has been to listen and ask questions. That was really funny for me to recognize in hindsight. Oh, this podcast happens to follow my principles here of doubling down on a skill that you already have.
So if I look at the plant, the scan, the pilot, and we get to the launch, and I'll give an example right in your podcast vein, because it's exactly what I did in January of 2012. I, quote, launched a podcast, a very specific trading podcast. But within 1 year, I was kind of like, I don't know. I've got other interests. And I convinced Dan Ariely to come on my show.
Nice.
And I got him on. And then I somehow or another got this other guy named Vernon Smith on, who had won a Nobel Prize. And he shared that Nobel Prize with Daniel Kahneman. And so then I got Kahneman to listen to Vernon Smith, and then Kahneman came on. Then once Kahneman came on, I would send requests out, and like everybody, you could just tell the gut feeling was everybody was scared to say no because Kahneman had said yes.
That is so awesome. And podcasts are like these magic loopholes in the universe where you really can connect with some of the most incredible people.
Yeah.
That if you had tried to write to Daniel Kahneman and say, hey, can I pick your brain for an hour? And it wasn't for a podcast, there's probably no way. I mean, maybe a snowball's chance that he would say yes. But when it's for a podcast, people are willing to do it. And it's a win all the way around because they're kind of happy that anyone listening will get to hear that conversation and benefit. And so that's so awesome. And then I love your show is a great example of a pivot too, that, okay, so you built the podcast muscles and you learned how to do it technically with the trading show. And then you pivoted the topic, but you kept going with the podcast. So once again, that's a great example of your pivot worked. It just, you hit a plateau a year in and said, okay, how do I freshen this up? How do I keep this interesting for myself? And then just pivoted to the topic.
I worry too, because I figure, well, my audience, but I have found the feedback is everyone's the same and everyone likes diversity. So as long as you have your core and then you expand out, people love it. But I think the reason I brought it up though too was because it was a launch. I mean, I had to, even if it wasn't in your exact form, I did not have your book at that time, but there was the planting, there was the skinning, there was the pilot in some form or another. I had done like 1 minute podcasts several years earlier, 4 or 5 years earlier. So this was really, I was to the point where I felt very comfortable and I just kind of pushed off and launched.
You know, you said you tend to just jump, but probably if you were to unpack some of your pivots, you would see that there were some more methodical steps within there, even though to you it might feel, and you're right, your risk threshold is probably higher than average, but what you're describing, this launch, this fourth stage is at some point you do have to communicate to your audience, hey everybody, this is the new direction. And that's the launch moment. It's that you've reduced risk, you've run experiments, you got those big fish on your show. There's still a point where you kind of have to stick your neck out and say, this is what I'm doing now. I really hope you come along for the ride and go all in on that new direction. The thing that's so counterintuitive in doing this creative work is we think we're going to leave our audience behind when actually most of them are ready to grow right there with us, that they're attracted to you and your brain and your way of thinking and curating, and they're in. And actually, like, they're probably excited. They're like, great. I was hoping for more as well, you know.
I'm curious though. Tell me if I read this wrong. It's 4 steps, but you have a 5th step, the lead step too?
Lead is kind of a meta stage, which is you can apply this method within organizations and also as a coaching or mentoring framework. So I encourage everyone to try this. Whenever someone comes to you next with a problem or says they just don't know about something, instead of either just commiserating, we tend to complain with each other a lot, or immediately trying to problem solve, which is actually not helpful, and it kind of robs them of their own thought process. You can say, well, do you want to do a little coaching around this? Okay, sure. So instead of giving your advice, just say, well, okay, what is working about this situation, or what are you enjoying? Okay, well, what does success look like? What do you want a year from now? Okay, great. Well, would it be helpful to brainstorm a couple things you might be able to do to kind of move you toward that vision, or toward that, you know, even if you don't want to use that word, so that you can use this as a conversation framework to lead and mentor and coach in a way that really accelerates progress in conversations.
I could keep pestering you with questions and asking things for a while, but I can't keep you. So, but there's a couple points that I just kind of want to end with. And I think for people that are thinking about, I talk to a lot of different people, and a lot of people often have really cool books to talk about. I would describe pivot as, I don't want to say academic, but it's dense, and it is one of these things where I think if somebody feels very comfortable going through and really breaking down step by step by step the potential pivot from where one is at now to somewhere else, you have really outlined exactly where to go. And I think, to put it more emotionally, if people are saying, well, God, I've got this fear of failure, I don't want to be rejected, and as you talk about in the book, rejection as a stepping stone, 100%. If you're not being rejected and you're not learning from rejection, you're missing out on something big. And ultimately, I think your big picture is, look, there are no perfect conditions. So you need to kind of untie from the dock a little and let the ship get out there in the water and get out in the deep part of the pool.
You've said that all so perfectly. Thank you. Thank you for just such a thorough examination and analysis, and you're right. Yes, it's very detail oriented. I think as people get better at pivoting, it's more instinctual. You can kind of return to this as you need it. And I've done this for projects. I've done this when I hit writer's block with the book. I even looked at, okay, well, what is working? What's my vision for the book? So you can, it becomes fun. It becomes more like a shorthand that you can use to just unpack any stuck point.
Jenny, the book is on Amazon now. Yes.
Yes, so excited. It is available for purchase, and I have tons of resources at the website, pivotmethod.com. You can take the pivotability self-assessment to see what your pivot profile is. And Michael, I bet I can guess yours. I'm most likely a pivot pro, but that's at pivotmethod.com/profile. And I also have an amazing team of coaches. If anybody wants one-on-one support, you can sign up for a 1-month jumpstart with them just to get the creative juices flowing.
Jenny, fun chat. Keep me posted on future work coming down the pike, because once you start this book podcast stuff, you can't stop. You know that, right?
It's so addicting.
Yeah, so you're stuck. You have to keep delivering. But listen, I appreciate you coming on today.
Michael, thank you so much for having me, and huge thanks to everybody for listening. This was so much fun.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.